They called it Zwaanendael, the Valley of the Swans. To the Dutch flatlanders, its giant sand dunes must have looked like mountains rising from the ocean's edge. The trumpeters, whistlers, and mutes winter there no longer. Their flyway has been altered by the settlement of Lewes, a town by the sea.
100 years after Columbus discovered America, Europeans were still seeking a shorter sea route to the spices and other wealth of the Indies. The Dutch joined the search by hiring Henry Hudson, a British captain. They gave him a boat called the Half Moon and sent him to find a passage across the top of the world.
But it's cold on the polar route, even in midsummer, and Hudson was soon faced with the threat of mutiny. After the rigging began icing over, he yielded to pressure from the crew and turned his Half Moon south. His friend, Captain John Smith of Virginia, had advised him that the way to the east through the land barrier of North America might lie just north of Chesapeake Bay. On August 28, 1609, the Half Moon entered a great bay, but it was full of shoals and had a strong tide running out. Hudson called it the South Bay, but knowing it was not the desired route, he headed his ship north. A year later, another British captain was driven into the same bay by a storm. He named it after his own commander, the governor of Virginia, Lord Delaware. But though Hudson's voyage gave the Dutch a claim on the territory, it was some time before they decided it might be valuable because they thought it was going to be a good place to catch whales, and whale oil for the lamps of Europe was worth real money. So it was that 22 years after Hudson's voyage, the Dutch established a colony of 32 persons at South River. Their life in the New World was to last less than a year, but their tiny settlement at Zwaanendael made possible the future state of Delaware.
My name is John Monroe. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. I'm perched here with Delaware Bay and the Roosevelt Inlet behind me to my right. All of this land once belonged to the Dutch. It was part of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. Primarily, that colony consisted of the Hudson River Valley and the Delaware River Valley. The West India Company had been chartered by the Dutch government in 1621 and given a monopoly of all the trade with the West Indies, which to the Dutch, as to the English and the French and the Spanish at that time, meant not just the islands that we think of now as the West Indies, but all of the Americas, North and South America, as well as the islands. As far as North America was concerned, their primary interest was in the fur trade with the Indians, but they didn't show much interest in settling, and some of the members of the company felt that if they didn't succeed in getting settlements in North America, their colony would be taken over by somebody else before long. And so to try to promote settlement, they decided in 1628 to open up great tracts of land to individual speculators who would come on their own and put up the money to found colonies within colonies that would be called patroonships. And the speculator was to get the title of a patroon. It means roughly patron, but it was much grander than that, and it carried all sorts of special privileges. It was Amsterdam merchants who had shown the most interest in North America, and among them was a man named Samuel Godin. Samuel Godin had heard that there were a good many whales sighted in Delaware Bay, and knowing that there were no settlements in this area, and hearing that the land would make good farming property, in 1629 he sent an agent named Gillis Hossett to America to buy land from the Indians. Hossett purchased a large tract of land in eastern Sussex, roughly 32 miles of coastline and several miles into the interior. And in 1631, they sent to America an expedition They called the colony Zwaanendael, which they planted. They brought horses with them and cattle and materials to build with and seeds to plant in the land, and they hoped to make a colony that would make a profit out of both farming and whaling in the bay. The whaling enterprise didn't come to much because either Godin was misinformed about whales in the bay, or they didn't know how to harpoon them and bring them ashore successfully. But the farming enterprise did get started in 1631 before the colony came to a sad end. The significance of Zwaanendael had nothing to do with its size. All they had was one lodging house or barracks that had trade goods in it and a cookhouse surrounded by a palisade. In that palisade, they erected, sometime in 1631, a post, and on that post they placed a piece of tin that had the coat of arms of the Netherlands painted on it. The Indians of North America did not know how to work metal and were attracted by this tin coat of arms. One Indian took it. The Dutch made a great to-do about it and impressed the Indians sufficiently with their loss that the Indian who had taken the coat of arms was put to death. The Dutch were appalled that the Indians had gone so far in their punishment as this. We know very little about what the Indians thought of what they might have felt to be a change of attitude on the part of the Dutch. At any rate, some Indians, probably clan members of the dead Indian, stole upon the Dutch settlers one day when they were at work in the fields and murdered them. 32 settlers were killed in this massacre, all the people at Zwaanendael. Years later, David de Vries wrote an autobiography recounting his many adventures all over the world. In the course of this autobiography, he tells the story of Zwaanendael and its destruction, and it is to de Vries and his account that we are principally indebted for our knowledge of the colony today. It is an interesting fact of history that it is not the principal sponsor, the founder of the colony, Samuel Godin, the merchant of Amsterdam, nor even the commander of the settlers who died there, Gillis Hossett, that are remembered today in Lewes, but de Vries, the historian of the colony.
After the failure of the first settlement at Zwaanendael, the patroonship was sold to the Dutch West Indies Company, who in turn sold the land to the city of Amsterdam, which wanted a colony to ensure its supplies of lumber and grain. This was the only North American colony ever owned and managed by a foreign city. In 1663, Peter Cornelis Placoy was allowed to bring 25 families to the Whorekill, as Zwaanendael was then called. Placoy was a Mennonite who dreamed of an idealistic, almost socialist community based on Christian principles and the equality of man. This was one of the first attempts to establish a utopian colony in the New World. Unfortunately, the bad luck which doomed the original Zwaanendael settlers continued. However, Placoy was not a victim of the Indians, but rather of the English. The Lewes site began as a Dutch possession. In 1664, the English took it over, putting an end to Placoy's experiment, only to have the Dutch retake the territory 10 years later. By this time, almost everyone in Whorekill had become naturalized citizens of England. This fact didn't stop Lord Baltimore from using the Dutch presence there as an excuse to send Captain Howe on an expedition to the young settlement. On Christmas Eve, Captain Howe ordered all the inhabitants to bring their arms and ammunition to him. He said he had orders from Lord Baltimore to burn every house and not to leave one standing, and that he was to give them but 1/4 of an hour warning before he did it. They begged that one house be spared for the women and children, and he replied that if God would save them one, they should have it. In fact, one building, a thatched barn, provided just such refuge, having failed to burn after repeatedly being set afire. Ironically, the following year, a Dutch-English peace treaty was signed, and possession of the tiny settlement reverted to England again. The one striking characteristic of Lewes's history is its chaos. Lewes was located at a strategic or a vulnerable place depending on which end of the cannon you happen to be standing on. It survived no fewer than 8 wars, and during each was terrorized or threatened to various extents. Lewes was involved in a struggle not only between nations, but also between individuals. While under English control, its ownership was disputed by William Penn, Lord Baltimore, and the Duke of York. The resolution of this last dispute led ultimately to establishment of Delaware as a state rather than as part of Maryland. William Penn used some of the fine print in Lord Baltimore's charter to lay claim to the Lewes area. Baltimore's charter, which was dated 1632, said that, in effect, Lord Baltimore was given all the land in the area which had not been planted or colonized by any Christian nation. When it was pointed out that the original settlement of Lewes in 1631 involved colonization by Christian men who cultivated the land, the case was made for Penn. But Penn couldn't keep the newly acquired area tied to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was controlled largely by Quakers, while the newly acquired territory was populated mostly by people belonging to the Church of England. By itself, this wouldn't have presented a problem. The problem arose from the Quaker view that military action, war, or even armed defense was unacceptable. This meant the Quakers were opposed to appropriating tax money paid by the residents of the new territory for their defense. But the people in the newly acquired area wanted to defend themselves. And if that meant breaking away from Pennsylvania, that's what they would do. Rather than resist the idea, William Penn allowed the area to become a separate entity. Its citizens kept the name of Sussex County and the town name of Lewes, which Penn had given them after places he knew well in England. And that is why the Zwaanendael Monument includes these words: that Delaware exists as a separate commonwealth is due to this colony. In the War of 1812, English ships blockaded the bay for months. Legend has it that the half-starved English sent a message to Lewes demanding food, which Lewes refused. So the English began to bombard the settlement. The town, using 4 cannons cleaned up from the Revolutionary War, returned the fire. But the Lewes defenders had only a few cannonballs, until someone realized that the incoming balls recovered from the beach fit the Lewes cannons. By nightfall, however, the British prepared to launch rowboats to take the town. But Commander Sam Davis built a bonfire and blackened the handles of every available tool and of dozens of cornstalks. In the firelight, the English thought they saw an army filling Lewes and went back to their ships. Historians wrote this account: 1 chicken killed, 1 pig wounded, cost of cannonballs, nothing. Gift of English Navy. In the midst of this chaotic history, there was one constant: the sea. It profoundly affected the lives of the people living at the mouth of the bay. This is the grave of Henry F. McCracken, a Delaware Bay and river pilot who requested that the anchor that saved his life be buried with him over 100 years ago. You can see the anchor fluke sticking out of the ground. The first Delaware Bay pilots were Indians. As ship traffic increased, the new settlers also acquired a knowledge of the treacherous bay shoals, and piloting became a common occupation of Lewes residents. The pilots were a hardy lot who sailed out in schooners in competition with each other. They raced to be the first to reach incoming ships to get the job of piloting them through the treacherous shoals and currents of the Delaware Bay and river. As years went by, the competition became so fierce that pilots would venture so far out to sea to be first to contact the incoming ships
that many were lost in storms. In a 4-year period, 3 boats and 17 men were lost. And these, of course, were the most knowledgeable and skilled seamen in the area. In 1896, the pilots chose cooperation over competition, and a pilots' association was formed. In many ways, the pilots have had far more contact with the outside world than most people. Just as the pilots had contact with the outside world, so did other residents of Lewes. Lewes was a port, and as these old ship timbers would tell if they could talk, many a shipwrecked passenger found refuge here. One of the more famous unexpected visitors was Jerome Bonaparte, brother of Napoleon, whose ship was forced into Lewes in a storm. The story goes his wife wouldn't dine in these simple surroundings until her silver table service was brought in from the ship. If some of Lewes' guests were famous, others were infamous. These were the pirates. It's not just any old pirates, but big-timers like Blueskin and Captain Kidd. Captain Kidd made Lewes his first port of call on his momentous voyage from the West Indies in 1700. He didn't come to plunder, though. Instead, he came to trade some of his loot with Lewes residents. This illegal smuggling by local merchants was discovered, and the offenders were punished by William Penn. Some pirates came to trade their loot, but others came to fill their chests. Yesterday morning, landed about 50 men, well armed, came up to town and plundered almost every house, committing great spoil, leaving scarce anything in the place. Around the turn of the century, Lewes was the site of a quarantine station. Passengers and sailors coming to Philadelphia were examined for contagious diseases on board ship in Lewes Harbor. If such sickness were found and the disease were curable, the passengers were quarantined in Lewes until they recovered. The social influence of outsiders could also be seen as a result of the Second World War. When German submarines sank many ships along the eastern coast, hundreds of survivors of torpedoed ships were brought ashore in Lewes. And some troops captured from Rommel's North Africa Corps were held in Lewes. As a deterrent to German submarines, Fort Miles was established on the Cape. At one time, over 10,000 men were stationed here. Some of these soldiers married local girls and settled here. There are still some active military installations on the Cape. It's the site of an Army recreation base, and the naval facility at Lewes studies the transmission of sound in seawater. Not all of Lewes's recent ties to the sea were military. For several years before the great schools of fish moved on, Lewes was the largest fishing port in the world in terms of tonnage of fish landed. In 1953, 500 tons of menhaden per day were caught for use as fertilizer. And there were 26 boats, each with 23 crew members, who caught menhaden with purse seines. Innovations started in the Lewes fisheries had been copied by the fishing industry all over the world. Fishing is still an important business in Lewes, but now it's sport fishing. Several party boat operators take thousands of fishermen out each year to try their luck with the trout, blues, flounder, and other game fish to be caught in Lewes waters.
Toss it out there. I don't want to walk around here and see bucktails out of the water.
Unlike the party boats, which carry up to 65 people, these boats cater to small parties of fishermen who want to catch something big or nothing at all. Marlin, dolphin, big blues, opie fish. Most of us think the only place delicious lobsters come from is Maine.
But these lobsters live around the rocks of the Lewes breakwater. It seems to provide them with the shelter they need. The breakwater does provide shelter, but it was built to provide shelter for ships. During the 4-year period from 1821 to 25, 200 cases of merchant shipwrecks were reported within the Delaware Bay. As a result, the federal government was petitioned to construct a breakwater. The project was started under John Quincy Adams in 1829 and was completed 40 years later. The construction spanned the terms of office of 12 presidents. It was a little over a mile long, built entirely with human muscle power, from stone quarried partly in the Brandywine area along the Delaware. However, it was still inadequate for newer, larger ships, and a longer breakwater was started in 1897. Using steam power, it took just 4 years to complete. Ironically, the breakwaters seem to be accelerating silt deposits in the bay they were built to protect. If stopping the waves is complicated, it's even more complicated understanding where they come from and how they develop. This unique wind and wave machine at the College of Marine Studies laboratory on Cape Henlopen is used to understand how waves are formed and how they behave. The study of mariculture, or sea farming, is another area of research carried out at the College of Marine Studies. These oysters and clams have been grown under nearly ideal conditions. Growing shellfish is one thing. Processing them is another. This company in Lewes processed 300,000 pounds of shellfish a day. The trick is to crush the shells and remove the meat without getting any shell into the finished product. This is accomplished by adding enough salt to the water to cause the meat to float and the shell to settle. Adding salt to water helps make this product, but taking salt out of water helps make this one. Magnesium is extracted from the seawater to make a popular stomach antacid. Speaking of stomachs, if you want to learn about the sea without risking seasickness, you can visit the Marine Museum. Although it's a small town, Lewes has several excellent museums, including this former lightship, which is open to the public as a part of the Historical Society's museum activities. Lights have always been an important aid to navigation. Because of its location near the Cape, Lewes has had a lighthouse in almost continuous operation for over 200 years. The famous Cape Henlopen Lighthouse was completed in 1767 and stood until 1926, when erosion caused it to topple into the sea. But even with a lighthouse, many ships went down in the bay during storms. In fact, so many ships sank in the bay that many Lewes residents made a living by salvaging anchors and selling them for scrap in Philadelphia. Some people were interested in recovering more than just the anchors from ships. This tombstone in St. Peter's Churchyard marks the grave of Captain James Drew, who commanded the British ship De Brock. On May 25, 1798, she was seeking anchorage a mile from Cape Henlopen Lighthouse. A sudden gust of wind caught her, and she went down with Captain Drew and many of the men. 3 Spanish prisoners had drifted ashore clinging to Captain Drew's sea chest. Because of the prisoners, the townspeople speculated that the De Brock had captured a Spanish treasure ship before her mishap in the bay. Since then, many groups have made salvage attempts on the ship, all unsuccessful. Although treasure is the first thing which comes to mind when one thinks of salvaging shipwrecks, Lewes residents have often taken a more utilitarian view. salvaging and using masts for curbstones, cannon for corner posts, and ballast stones for building the foundations of some of their houses. Many of the artifacts of these early ships are preserved at the Zwaanendael Museum. The museum was modeled after the town hall in Hoorn, Holland, the hometown of David de Vries, who helped organize the original Dutch expedition to Zwaanendael. You can see Lewis's history in the street signs and in the architecture, as well as in the museums. For 350 years, the sea has directed Lewis's history. As long as the sea remains, the land it touches will be under its influence, and the people who live there will move to its rhythm.